welcome back to another edition of Thoughts on What I've Been Watching, April 2021 edition. I'm very excited to talk about some of the movies and TV shows that I've watched over the course of April in this crazy year of 2021. Just like last month, which was the first month that I did this in March of 2021, I'm going to talk about a variety of new movies and old that I've been watching throughout the course of April here, as well as a couple TV shows. Unfortunately, was not able to watch quite as much this month. In March, I did have some time off. As a teacher, in between second and third trimester, we had spring break. And with the birth of my daughter, I took a little bit of time off as well. So had a little bit more time in March, not as much in April, but I did still see some good things. So there's some movies and TV shows that I was able to watch, so I'm excited about. I am also, before I get started here, very excited to finally say that I'm going to finish my best of 2020 list. So every year I've put out a best of 2020 list on Instagram and Facebook, and I have not done it yet this year. Just because I was still finishing some films on my watch list. So I did manage to finish a few movies that I still wanted to watch. So now I feel confident in putting together a list, and it will be the best of the year top 50. Last year I did top 50 for the first time, and I plan on doing top 50 again this year. I did actually, believe it or not, see enough movies where I would recommend that many films. So look forward to that. That'll be coming out soon. It'll be the first time I've done a video for my favorite films of the year since like when I was in college. I think 2015 or something like that. I did a best of the year list. Ever since then, I've just put out a list on social media. So I'm excited that I'll be able to do it in video format again. So 2020 best of the year list, that'll be coming soon. And then I am also continuing my 1001 movies you must see before you die challenge. So each month, I said this last month in my March video that I'd be watching a couple films each month from my 1001 movies you must see before you die 2015 edition book. So I did manage to see a couple more films on that list. I watched the first two last month, and I watched the next two this month. So it's gonna be every month just digging away at that 1001 movies. It'll take a few years, but each month that I do this, I will definitely talk about the ones that I've seen. I also started a game for the first time on the podcast. So with Jimmy Cotter and Connor McKinney, my first two guests for classics We Are Embarrassed We Haven't Seen. And I will, at the end of this week, actually have the second edition of that game out with a few more friends. So I'm excited to continue that series. And I'll still continue to talk about new movies. I'm just kind of waiting for some new movies to discuss. I'm excited to talk about The Conjuring 3 coming out soon. There's a few other movies coming out that I will be doing some videos for, but so stay tuned for that. But for now, let's get into it. Let's get into my thoughts on what I watched in April of 2021. So first up, I did watch some movies for my podcast. I watched the entirety of the MonsterVerse, and I talked about that in an early podcast episode with guests Justin D'Agostino and Mike Carter. We discussed Godzilla 2014. We discussed Kong, Skull Island 2017. We discussed Godzilla King of the Monsters, and then Godzilla vs. Kong. I really enjoyed the original 2014 Godzilla, and I said that, and you can hear my in-depth thoughts on all of them in that podcast episode. I enjoyed Godzilla 2014. Kong was, it's fun, silly, campy monster movie. Godzilla 2014, though, had a lot more themes and some visually interesting choices that were made by the director that I really enjoyed. What's his name? By the guy who did Rogue One. It's escaped me right now, but I thought he did a nice job. King of the Monsters was not a fan of, and Godzilla vs. Kong was fun. I enjoyed it. It was worth watching. I wish I could have seen it on a big screen because I think that would have made it even more fun. Another film that I watched that was on HBO Max that I don't really want to talk about very much. I was going to do a podcast episode for it, but I was so bored with it that I did not end up doing an episode. Was Mortal Kombat. I have no affinity, no affiliation, no connection or nostalgia for anything Mortal Kombat. I mean, I've played a couple of the arcade games here and there, but I've never had any connection or knowledge of the lore or any of the characters surrounding it. So I have HBO Max. I just thought I'd check it out. Maybe it would be worth talking about on a podcast. But other than the first 10 minutes were actually really, really good. after that, it was just so dumb. I just couldn't find it in my heart to have the passion to do an episode with some guests talking about that movie. So it was dumb. If you want something dumb and entertaining, check it out. But I really wouldn't recommend it other than that. And if you had HBO Max, just for the heck of it. The first movie, though, that I want to talk about for a list of new movies, I'm going to do new movies first. I just wanted to mention that those were a few that I had watched for my podcast. The first one is a documentary that is on HBO Max, I believe, and it's called David Byrne's American Utopia. If you don't know who David Byrne is, he was the lead singer of the very famous rock band Talking Heads. And since moving on from Talking Heads, he has led a solo career and made a lot of great albums, many albums. And his most recent one that he did, actually, it might not even be his most recent one at this point, but he made an album, I think, a year or two ago called American Utopia. And so then he turned that album, which is very socially aware, politically aware, like it's a very ambiguous, heavily metaphorical album for a lot of like social problems and as well as political and social commentary. And he basically took the album and turned it into a stage show, a Broadway show performance. I mean, it's incredible. And then he had Spike Lee direct a filmed movie version that you could call it a documentary, you can call it a staged filmed musical. It's kind of combines a few different elements there. David Byrne in between performances talks to the audience, and there's a portion during the credits where Spike Lee is following the cast around the streets in New York on bikes. So it's a very unique experience, and it's definitely one that, especially if you like Talking Heads and David Byrne and Spike Lee, that I think are worth checking out. It'll definitely be on my 2020 list. But it's a very interesting experience with great music, and it's very thought-provoking as well. The next movie I watched was You Cannot Kill David Arquette. This is another documentary, and I believe it was on Hulu. David Arquette is an actor. And I don't have a great, he's not like one of my favorite actors or anything, but I've always thought he was solid in the Scream films. He plays the cop in the Scream movies. That's what he's most known for. And I didn't realize the trajectory of his career. So this documentary kind of details how David Arquette, basically how his career went on a decline after he chose to get into professional wrestling. Even though he cared about it deeply, it kind of came off as a joke to the professional wrestling world. And he was actually awarded a world championship belt like 20 years ago, kind of right around the prime of his career. And after that, he kind of became a laughing stock and a huge joke in Hollywood, and the wrestling community hated him. So now he's like almost 50 years old. He's like in his mid to late 40s, and he still is struggling, quote unquote. I mean, he's doing fine, but he's not getting the roles and the jobs that he wants to, because he's not really taken seriously anymore. He's kind of typecast into this dorky comedic role. And even though that is nagging him in the documentary, what really nags him is this whole thing with professional wrestling, because apparently he cares about professional wrestling quite a bit and how he was a laughing stock of the community. So this is kind of like, have you ever seen Darren Aronofsky's film The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke that was really good in 2008? This is like a real life version of that, except instead of it being a real wrestler, it's actor David Arquette. Like, they basically follow him around as he tries to get back into the world of professional wrestling, and kind of the unbelievable lengths he goes to get in. I mean, from backyard wrestling matches to like these pain wrestling matches with like weapons, and he gets like, almost dies. He gets like his throat cut by accident in one of these wild back alley wrestling events that just goes too far. I mean, he does these crazy things, and it's quite a journey. The presentation is very like guerrilla style, like they're following him around, and they're like in kind of the gritty griminess of all the stuff he's doing. I mean, it's well edited, has some good music. And it's just very engaging. I found myself very invested in this documentary. So You Cannot Kill David Arquette, and I believe it's still on Hulu. The next new film from 2020 I watched, that's probably not going to quite make my list. Oh, You Cannot Kill David Arquette will likely make my list. The next one is a film called Babyteeth. Babyteeth, I believe, is on Hulu right now. It is a debut. It is a directorial debut from Shannon Murphy. And it's about a terminally ill teen who upsets her parents when she falls in love with a small time drug dealer. This is an Australian film with a mostly Australian or English cast. Um, and it's quite a debut for someone who it's their first film. Shannon Murphy, I believe, also wrote the film. And it's a coming of age drama story. The cinematography in this movie is unbelievable. It's some of the best that I think I saw in 2020. It's very intimate, very purposeful. All four leads in this movie are also excellent. I really enjoyed Eliza Scanlon, who I had just seen in Little Women less than 2 years ago. She is the main character. Ben Mendelsohn, who is always really good, plays her dad. Essie Davis, who is amazing in The Babadook, plays her mom. And then Toby Wallace, who I had never heard of before, he plays the drug dealer that she falls in love with. They're all incredible. They're great performances. The movie has a very interesting structure, and that the narrative is very choppy, but like intentionally. Like there's passages of time that happen without provocation, without you even realizing. Like all of a sudden, quite a bit of time has gone by. So the structure is very unique in that regard. Has great music. However, I didn't love this movie. While I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend checking it out if you have Hulu, or if you're looking for something different, a drama movie. I just didn't. I didn't really invest in the characters. While they were great performances, I felt like any of my investment in the characters or my emotions for them was just because of the performances. I didn't think the writing, in terms of how they're characterized, was particularly strong, or like I just didn't care about them. I didn't find it that interesting. The story was somewhat unique, but the story also, I think, just didn't really grab me either. I think just kind of the things that I praised a moment ago were what I enjoyed the most. But like the movie ended, and like I was like, oh, that was good, but I don't know if I would stop and watch it again. I enjoyed watching it, and I'd probably check out what this director did next. But I didn't absolutely love it. So Babyteeth, on Hulu, Australian film. The next film that I watched is a Mexican film, I'm No Longer Here. And in Spanish, it's Ya no estoy aquí. I think this was one of the only Mexican. I saw a couple Spanish language films this year, but I think this was the only Mexican film I managed to see. So it takes place it's kind of an epic. It's a very sweeping film that takes place over a long period of time, over several years, and it follows this one gang leader in Monterrey, Mexico. And basically, as the gang is kind of caught up in some trouble, he ends up having to migrate to the U.S. To avoid getting mixed up with the local cartel. And he's in a gang, but they're like teenagers, and they're not like committing crimes. Basically, they call themselves a gang because it's a label, and they're just like rebels. Like they're not really doing anything like criminal in the movie, but they are associated with older gang members who are criminals, and that's how they kind of get mixed up with the cartel. And it is a unique story, especially for like following up. I just talked about Babyteeth. This one's kind of a coming of age story as well, a far more grounded one in terms of if you live in the United States and you kind of see people who get caught up in gang violence and drug violence, and in North America, and people who have to leave their country from Central America trying to escape this kind of stuff. So it also, the story portrays the gang's love of cumbia, which is a very traditional type of dance and song. So that was, I thought, a very unique aspect of the film as well. It has a really haunting final shot too. There's an image at the end of this film. If you get a chance to see it, this one's on Netflix. So if you have Netflix, Ya no estoy aquí, or I'm no longer here, is streaming on there. The final shot of this film is haunting. I won't spoil anything, but it stuck with me as the movie ended. And I'm still thinking about it right now. I love the simplicity of it, and I love how much they're able to convey in terms of themes and ideas in this movie without ever being preachy. Just kind of show you the journey of this one individual. Modern portrayal of immigration. It's kind of heartbreaking, the broken family dynamics that end up coming out because of what happens with this kid. It's this kind of really grounded, sprawling crime gang story that incorporates immigration and drug the fallout of people getting affected by drug and gang situations. So it's very grounded, kind of lower class film in that regard. Technical aspects aren't flashy, but they're well done. Great use of music. This one I didn't overwhelmingly love, but I did enjoy it, and I think it's one that if you have Netflix, you should check out, especially if you're looking for a Spanish language film. And I will probably have this either as an honorable mention or at the end of my list. So I'm No Longer Here, Ya No Estoy Aquí on Netflix. The next new film that I saw was a British film. I think it's a co-production between, I think maybe like UK and Ireland. I can't remember exactly. I think it was co-production between a few countries, but it does take place in England, I believe. It's called Sorry We Missed You, and it's directed by Ken Loach, who is a much older director and apparently has done quite a few films. Another recent film he did is called I, Daniel Blake, which I've heard a lot of good things about, have not had a chance to see. But the film is probably one of the most depressing movies I have ever seen. Um, um, in my review on Letterboxd said the award for most depressing film of 2020 goes to. If you are not in the right headspace to watch a like hard hitting, very serious drama that's super grounded, super realistic, wouldn't recommend this. I mean, scene after scene, the film rips your heart out. It's about this family who is kind of 10 years after the 2008 financial crisis still cannot get back up on their feet. They're still struggling. And basically, it just kind of over the course of the film, you follow this family of four as the parents. You see them at their jobs. They're lower class, blue collar jobs. The mom takes care of old people in home patient work. The father is a parcel deliveryman. That's what they call it in the UK, parcel delivery, package delivery. Basically, kind of like an Amazon type deal, and they just are very down their luck. And then they're dealing with their kids who are having issues at school, especially their son is getting into trouble. And this film has almost no happy moments. I mean, the ending, the credits roll, and you're like, want to cry. Like, the ending isn't happy either. For what it's going for, I mean, it's incredible. The performances, the dialogue, the narrative, they're all very well done. It's almost like a documentary. It feels so real. There's nothing really flashy. There's almost no music used. It's all diegetic music, music that's within the film. There's no like score that I remember. So that also makes it feel very realistic and really adds to the weight of the film. It's quite a tragedy, I would say, a heartbreaking film. So if you want a really well-made drama and you don't mind crying and being depressed, check it out. But otherwise, I don't know if I would recommend it. I rented this one on Amazon Prime. I don't know if any of the big streaming services have it right now. I rented it on Amazon. The next new film that I watched was one that I'd heard about for quite a while, called First Cow, that a lot of critics have named one of the best films of 2020, and I'd been hearing this hyped up for a while. It's from Kelly Reichardt, and I'm not sure if this is her debut or one of her first films, but I was not familiar with her going into this, with her work. And so basically the film takes place in Oregon Territory. I believe it's in like the 1800s. I don't remember exactly which decade in the 1800s, but it's when Oregon, I think it's not even a state yet. It's just called the Oregon Territory. And it kind of follows this cook who's working for fur trappers and how he meets a Chinese immigrant who's trying to seek his fortune in the United States. And basically they collaborate together to try and create a successful business. But their business kind of is entirely based on a lie and a scam with a cow. So I won't spoil exactly how that works. But it is a very interesting, unique story. It's incredibly well made. The commitment to the time period in terms of the costumes, the sets, the dialogue, and the look, overall production of the film is phenomenal. Unfortunately, I just could not get into this movie. The characters and the narrative, were fine. I just never found myself wrapped up in them and completely caring about what was going on. The whole time I was like, wow, this looks great. It's a really well made film. I'm very impressed by it. But I just have no desire at this moment to ever watch it again. It might be in my honorable mentions. I don't know if it would quite make it or not, but I feel sad not having really loved this because a lot of people really did. I recommend maybe checking it out. It sounds like something interesting to you. This was another one I think I just rented on Amazon. I don't think it was streaming anywhere, but it's a good movie. I just didn't love it. The next movie I wrote a review for on Instagram and Facebook off my Letterboxd account because I could not wait to talk about it. It is called Shithouse. And actually, it has an alternate title in some other countries called Freshman Year. So depending on what country you're seeing it in, it might be called Freshman Year. The title Shithouse, the HIT is edited out with like expletives, like characters, depending on where you're seeing the poster. And it is basically a student film. So this movie was made by a 22-year-old who wrote it, directed it, edited it, and he's the lead in the movie. His name is Cooper Raiff. He got $15,000 to make this movie, so micro budget, and it is phenomenal. It's unbelievable. I can't believe how good it is. So the movie is about a lonely college freshman, and Cooper plays the character. The character's name is Alex, who basically is trying to figure out college and just can't fit in. And the movie takes place over one weekend, about 6 months into his freshman year. And basically the course of the 2-hour film just follows him for that one weekend as he's trying to fit in at parties and trying to meet a girl, and just try and figure out what he wants to do. The final portion of the film jumps ahead in time, but the majority of the film just takes place over the one weekend. And I gotta tell you, I was not expecting this movie to be so good. I'd heard praise for this movie, and that it was kind of an underrated, underappreciated gem of 2020. But with the title, I was not expecting such an aggressive title. The title of the film is also the name of a party house in the movie that they go to. I still think the name is pretty bad, just because I feel like it would turn a lot of people off. You see Shithouse, you're like, what the hell is this movie? But it is, the movie is super intimate, sensitive, it's touching, it's funny, it's emotionally engaging. It's very well done for the budget and the amateur. You got a first-time filmmaker who's 22 years old, and I read mostly made it with all of his friends. There's a couple big names in this movie for like younger actors who have been in other things, but they're not like huge celebrities or anything. But this movie just captures. It's like a microcosm for college. This one weekend, like it just captures the college experience beautifully. It kind of reminded me of Richard Linklater's Everybody Wants Some or Dazed and Confused, where they kind of follow some characters in high school or college over the course of just like a couple days, or one day for Dazed and Confused. So it kind of reminded me of that, but it just beautifully captures the awkwardness, the good, the bad, the ugly, the spirit of going away to college. And I'm just so impressed for how little money they had and how well this movie is done. Obviously the budget does show at times. There's sometimes you're like, yeah, you can tell this was made for $15,000, but other times I'm like blown away by how good it is for the money they had, especially with how young these people are, with how young Cooper is for making this movie. Definitely not a perfect movie, but I'm so impressed with it and I enjoyed it. I'm going to recommend it to everyone. It's going to be high on my 2020 list, and I think everyone should check it out. I believe Shithouse, you can rent it on VOD, but it's also streaming on Showtime. So if you have a Showtime account or start a channel through Amazon Showtime subscription, Shithouse is on Showtime. The next movie I want to talk about, that's another new film that I watched that I am actually going to be doing a podcast episode for probably in a week. So I don't want to talk about it too much, but it's called The Empty Man. And it's a horror movie that is right now in my top 10 for 2020. And it is one of the most overlooked and underrated films of 2020. It's a movie that no one saw. And I just found out about it in March because of Chris Stuckman, who reviews movies on YouTube. He did a review for it, and that was the only way I'd ever even heard of it. I wasn't going to watch it, never even knew what it was. I would just recommend, again, I'm going to do an episode, podcast episode talking about it very soon, so I'm going to save more of my thoughts for it then. But if you're interested in it, just on my recommendation, don't look up anything about it. Don't look up anything. I rented it on Amazon for like $2 or $3, and I think I ended up buying it. It was like $5 to just buy it. So I rented it and enjoyed it, and then I just bought it so that I can watch it again for my podcast. Don't look up anything. If you love horror, this movie will blow your mind. It's a 2-hour and 20-minute like horror epic, and it is not. If you just go watch the trailer for it, it was Fox's last movie. So Fox, Disney put this out through Fox in October after Disney acquired Fox, and I think it was their last film to have the Fox 20th Century Fox logo in the movie before Disney officially like acquired Fox and completely redid the, completely revamped the company. So that's why it kind of got dumped out. I mean, the commercial came out or the advertisement came out like 1 week before it was released. So no one saw it, no one knew about it. And the commercial does not accurately portray the movie at all. It's so weird, the whole situation behind it. So The Empty Man, I'm going to be talking about in probably a week or so here. So if you want to hear me talk about it more, go watch it and then come back and watch my episode when I talk about it in depth. The next movie that I saw that was a new movie that came out in 2020 was a Portuguese film called Bacurau. And this was another movie that I'd seen a ton of hype and praise for, and it unfortunately just did not click with me. A lot of people are describing this as like a John Carpenter homage, because it does blend a lot of weird genres. It's very hard film to describe. It's super, super weird. And I don't even really know how to describe it. Like the synopsis online is Bacurau is a small town in Brazil. Oh, did I say Portuguese? The film the language is Portuguese. The movie's Brazilian. So excuse me, I'm sorry. This small town in Brazil, Bacurau, mourns the loss of its matriarch, Carmelita, who is going to be 94 years old. And days later, the inhabitants notice their community has vanished from most maps. That's like the synopsis online. And that just barely is like the tip of the iceberg for what happens in this movie. If you want something really weird and genre blending, it's well made. It's very beautifully shot. It's on location. Great production design, solid performances. It's just so weird. It's so weird. And my biggest problem was I couldn't really invest into any of the characters. The characters aren't really the point. This movie has a lot of symbolism. They're trying to like get a very heavy-handed political message across. And it's heavy-handed to some, but others it's not so heavy-handed. You might have to read into it a bit more. I thought it was pretty obvious some of the messages they're trying to convey. I just didn't really care. It just didn't connect with me that much. So I mean, it is an intriguing and weird movie. If you're interested in looking at something very bizarre, check it out. I guess I'm probably not going to put it on my 2020 list, but I didn't hate myself for watching it. So the only other new film before I get into some older films is Just Mercy. I rewatched Just Mercy. It technically was a 2020 wide release. It came out in January. It was limited in December of 2019, but its wide release was technically January. So this film is actually going to be on my 2020 list. I absolutely adore Just Mercy. I put a review out for it last summer when I first watched it, and I had mentioned that this movie was way better than it had any right being, just because these types of films, especially with such a lame name, I'm sorry, Just Mercy, it sounds like a really Hollywood cheese fest, trying to lovey-dovey movie or something about real events, especially when it comes to racism. Hollywood, like Green Book, great example. Hollywood has a very family-friendly approach to racism, so I'm always very apprehensive. I think independent films tend to deal with racism in a much more thought-provoking and serious manner than Hollywood's major studios do. But this film blew me away because it is not Hollywood. It is very well done. It's not cheesy. It's not pandering. It's very in your face. Does not care that it's showing you things that are really disturbing and hard to watch. And it's incredibly well made. I mean, the execution of this film is phenomenal. And so this movie exceeded my expectations. Just Mercy, again, while I'm not a huge fan of the title of the film and the advertising made it seem really cheesy, it blew me away in every aspect of it. And it's going to be very high on my 2020 list. And I would recommend to everyone, definitely check this movie out. It's phenomenal. And I think that about covers all the new films I watched in 2020 that were either 2020 releases or 2021 releases. Yep, that's about it. So before we get into some older films, I do want to mention a couple TV series. I did, with my wife, manage to watch Schitt's Creek, which just finished their final season in 2020. And I think it was only 6 seasons, 10 episode seasons, and they're each 20 minutes. So it's a really fast watch. I mean, it's 60 episodes at 20 minutes apiece. So it's fast. Like you can knock it out in like less than a month. We watched it, I think, in less than a month. Especially when our newborn daughter, we were stuck at home, with her, pretty much taking care of her all day. So we watched the show for something fun and lighthearted. I really enjoyed this show. I don't know if I put it up there with some of my favorite sitcoms, but I like the premise. I loved listening to Dan Eugene Levy talk about the idea behind this show, about how Dan, who is brilliant in this show. I think he's great as David. I think he is a very underrated actor. He was great in Happiest Season, which will be on my 2020 list, a movie that came out last year. I love him in this show. I think him and Patrick, their relationship is probably one of my favorite relationships I've seen in a sitcom. I'd probably put that up there with one of my favorites. I really liked how this show represents like the LGBTQ community, because the show doesn't like show you homophobia, right, or any kind of phobia or struggle. It just presents them as people, and like and while there's a few moments in the show where like there's characters who are worried about certain things in terms of their lifestyle, it's never played out in a way that's like or like typical movies and TV shows. It's always played as like drama and like very serious, like they got to deal with all these horrible things, which I know is part of it. But I like how this show, it's just like it's just part of life. Like they love each other, and it's a lot of fun to watch that. And I think it's a very fun sitcom to watch. I really enjoyed it. So Schitt's Creek, definitely worth checking out. My wife and I just started rewatching The Sopranos, which is one of the greatest shows ever made. We're rewatching it because of the new movie that's coming out. And then I actually just started Deadwood. I'd never seen Deadwood, and actually got to give a shout out to my buddy John Horford, who had recommended it to me. I've always wanted to see it, but he basically told me how great it was and that I needed to watch it. So I was like, okay, I'll break down. I'll check this show out. So I'm watching it right now. I'm almost this whole season into it. It's pretty good. All right, before we wrap this up, I do have some old films I want to talk about. Now, two of these old films I already talked about in my podcast, King Kong 1933, Godzilla 1954. Did watch those for my episode on Godzilla versus Kong. So if you want to get my thoughts, in-depth thoughts on those two movies, you can check out that episode. But it was a first time watch, and I did enjoy both of them. I rewatched 1921's The Kid for my film class, one of my favorite movies of all time. It's in the public domain, meaning it's free on YouTube. If you want to watch it, Charlie Chaplin, his direct feature length debut, one of my favorite films of all time. For another episode of my podcast, I watched Thelma and Louise, 1991. So if you want to listen to classics we are embarrassed we have not seen, my first game of that, I gave with two guests my very in-depth thoughts on Thelma and Louise, first time watch. Really enjoyed that movie. I also rewatched Singin' in the Rain, 1952, for my film class that I'm teaching at the high school as well. Love that movie. If you've never seen Singin' in the Rain, I'm not a musical guy at all, and it's one of my favorite movies. The last film I want to talk about before I do my 1001 movies discussion was I watched the Korean horror thriller action film I Saw the Devil, which is a 2010 film. It's currently on Amazon Prime. I had never seen it before, and I'd always heard people praise it as one of the great films of the 2010s. It came out in 2010, and a lot of people always recommend it with Korean cinema. Korean cinema is phenomenal. Lots of great Korean films every year, and I always hear this as one of the greats. I don't think I love this movie, but I cannot recommend it unless you are looking for this kind of movie. It is basically about a serial killer the movie opens with one of his victims, and the victim is married to a man who works in like the Secret Service equivalent in Korea, and his father-in-law, the victim's dad, is like a retired officer. So obviously their background, they work in crime and this kind of world, and so they end up the son or the husband ends up basically on a revenge rampage to get this guy. Now, it sounds like something you might have seen 100 times before, but they kind of flip the revenge genre on its head, and they do a lot of things that I was not expecting. And they also kind of present some interesting themes that come with the idea of revenge and seeking and wanting revenge, all while showcasing some of the most disturbing and brutal violence. Um, it's up there with some of the most disturbing and brutal violence I've ever seen. It's horrifying. It's grotesque. Basically, it's a deep dive again into the mind of a serial killer and the mind of a man driven to revenge against a serial killer. And it just basically pits them against each other. I think it's kind of a masterpiece in this genre, action revenge horror film. I don't think you can get much better than this in terms of what they're going for. A lot of it seems very original. It's brutal to the point of nausea sometimes, hard to watch. The violence is almost going too far quite often, very realistic. Um, you're often wondering how far are they going to go when you're watching some of this. But it's a very well done movie. It's just you got to be ready for something like this. You got to watch something like this. I really enjoyed it as a first time watch, but it's brutal. Again, I saw The Devil, 2010 Korean film. It's on Amazon Prime. All right, last two films I want to talk about. So I'm doing my 1001 movies you must see before you die challenge, where I'm going to try to watch all of these movies from my 2015 edition of the book over the next couple of years. So each month I'm going to watch a few. I managed to watch two this month. The only reason I managed to watch two is because one of them was over 3 hours and the other one was 6.5 hours. So the two films from the book I watched were the third and the fourth entries. The third entry in this book is The Birth of a Nation from 1915 by D.W. Griffith. I feel like most people have heard of this film at some point, or you're aware of it, or you've seen clips of it shown for the purpose of history. So if you're not aware, The Birth of a Nation, and when it came out in 1915, was at the time considered like an early blockbuster before blockbusters were a thing. This movie made a lot of money. It was also reviled. It still is. It's still a movie that's pretty abhorrent. Basically, it's KKK propaganda. The movie literally re-inspired, like reinvigorated the KKK. Like the KKK in 1915, it kind of died down and it lost a lot of popularity, and this movie spiked membership and got people interested in it again. The movie is based on a play called The Klansman that basically paints the KKK and the South as like the victims and then subsequently the heroes of America post Civil War, and basically treats the Northerners as like the villains. And it's that regard like hilarious and horrifying at the same time. And it's racism. There's some really racist stuff in this movie. However, the reason it's still watched today and still considered a great film, great quote unquote, is for its filmmaking aspects. It's over 3 hours and it's pretty engaging. There's some war sequences, Civil War sequences that were some of the first war sequences ever filmed for movies in their first half of this film that have thousands of extras, and it's pretty amazing for 1915 and what they pulled off in some of these sequences. The movie's super complex in its storytelling, incorporate a lot of pans and tracking shots, a lot of things that were not used at the time or like were invented or set the stage for years to come for filmmaking. So it has an interesting place in cinema history. And I think it's something that if you're really interested in history and cinema history, that you should watch at least once. It is also in the public domain because it's so old. The whole thing's uploaded on YouTube, so you can watch it in its entirety there. But again, you got to go into it knowing where it's coming from, and that it's coming from a pretty hateful place, pretty racist place, and just watch it as a time capsule as well as to kind of see, some of the greatest filmmaking techniques where they came from, where they started. So yeah, 1915, The Birth of a Nation. And then the fourth entry in the book, which I believe is the last film I'm talking about here, is a 1915-1916 10-part serialized French film called Les Vampires. I think that's how you say it. It's The Vampires. Excuse me. So it is about a gang in Paris in 1915 and 1916 called the Vampires, who are committing crimes all over Paris. and subsequently being followed and tracked down by a journalist um, named Philip or Philippe. Philippe. Um, it's easily the longest movie I've ever seen. So this is before television. So back before television, they made something called serials or serialized films, where filmmakers wanted to make a movie that continued a story that was longer than 1, 2, or 3 hours, but it didn't make sense to show it all at once in a theater. So they made these serialized films where they would release it in parts. So the shortest part is like 15, 20 minutes, and then there's quite a few that are like 50 to 60 minutes. And the whole thing ends up being about 6.5 hours in length. So I broke it up. There was a couple early episodes that are short, so I watched them back to back. But basically, in like 7 or 8 sittings, 6 or 7 sittings, I think I watched the whole thing over the course of like 2 weeks. Um, it's incredible. It's very well done, and I enjoyed it. It's something that I would probably watch again because it is pretty entertaining. It's very complex and sophisticated in terms of its like characters and storytelling, its narration. I actually had trouble following it sometimes. They do recap a lot of things with the inner titles on the screen. It's a silent film, but I often had to kind of follow the plot online as I was watching or after each episode. Because it's also just not realistic for someone to sit through a 6.5 film, let alone a 6.5 hour silent film. So breaking it up, it also made it a little bit more difficult. So it's a very ambitious project in its length and its storytelling, because there's a ton of characters. It's a sprawling story, but it is very well done. Some of the stunts and the set pieces and action sequences are pretty impressive for the time period. It's pretty violent. Some of the later episodes have some pretty violent scenes that I was kind of surprised for the time period. They would not be considered violent now. I did read that apparently at the time this film was considered immoral by a lot of critics because of all the crimes and things that are committed in the movie. But it is a crime film. But it's definitely one that I enjoyed. It was a very interesting movie, a very interesting experience, and checking this one out is definitely worth your time if you're interested. All 6 parts, the whole thing is uploaded to YouTube. So most of these old films, because they're in the public domain, no one has the copyright for them anymore. They're just free to the public. So you can upload them to YouTube. So people if you go on YouTube, you can find Les Vampires, the vampires, all 6.5 hours of it if you want to check it out. But I enjoyed it. It's worth checking out. Very interesting experience for sure. All right. That is it for my thoughts on everything I watched in April 2021. Like I mentioned, I will be back very soon with a couple different episodes. I have Game 2 of Classics We're Embarrassed We Have Not Seen coming out later this week. I will have my 50 favorite films of 2020 list coming out later this week. And I'm also going to do an episode talking about The Empty Man, an overlooked horror movie of 2020. So look forward to more episodes coming out very soon. Thank you for listening. And I'm Vince. This is the Film Nerd Podcast. And until next time, go watch some movies.